9 years of marriage, one near-death accident, and a web of lies I never saw coming. My wife and uncle weren't just having an affair, they left me to die. But as I uncovered their betrayal, I found an unexpected ally. And the truth was darker than I ever imagined. Enjoy the story. It was always the same, monotonous, predictable, suffocating. My life had become a ticking clock, each second marked by the repetitive, hollow clicks of an existence I had long since grown to resent. 9 years of marriage, one child, and a home that felt more like a prison than a refuge. Silence echoed through the rooms, between us, between me, and the person I used to be. The only moment of peace I had left was my morning bike ride, a daily ritual that gave me a sense of freedom, however fleeting. The cold wind on my face was a reminder that I was still alive, that I could still feel something other than the quiet, numbing bitterness of my marriage. Every morning, I would slip out of the house before dawn, leaving my wife still asleep, or at least pretending to be. Her indifference was the only thing I could count on anymore. This morning started like any other. I pedaled along the quiet, deserted streets of our suburban neighborhood. The only sound was the rhythmic hum of the tires on asphalt and the occasional chirping of birds just waking with the rising sun. It was peaceful, almost soothing. But then I saw it. A car speeding toward me, its engine roaring like a wild animal. At first, it seemed like just another reckless driver in a hurry. But as it got closer, I noticed the woman behind the wheel. She was stunning, dark hair flowing, eyes wide with an intensity that didn't belong on this quiet street. For a second, our eyes locked, and everything seemed to slow down, like time itself had stopped to acknowledge the strangeness of the moment. And then came the horn, blaring. The screeching of tires filled my ears. I felt my body jerk, but my mind couldn't keep up. The world spun into chaos, and then nothing, just darkness that I woke to a dull, persistent beeping. My head felt like it had been split open, and every attempt to focus was met with a wave of nausea. The sterile smell of antiseptic stung my nose, and the harsh fluorescent lights overhead were blinding. It took a moment for the disjointed fragments of memory to click into place. The car, the woman, the horn. Then nothing. I was in a hospital bed. I tried to move, but a sharp pain shot through my side, pinning me down. My vision was still blurry, but I could make out 2 figures standing at the foot of my bed. My wife, Anna, and my uncle, Greg. Their faces were strange mirrors of each other, strained, anxious, but lacking any real warmth. Anna, cold and distant as ever, stood with her arms crossed. Her eyes flickered nervously, avoiding mine, as though this was just another inconvenient task she had to check off her list. Greg, on the other hand, seemed too eager, his usual calm demeanor replaced with an almost jittery nervousness. Something about the way they stood there together, their body language, felt off. "You're lucky to be alive," Greg said with forced cheer, stepping closer. "A car hit you while you were on your bike. I found you lying there, unconscious, in the middle of the road." Anna shifted uncomfortably, her eyes finally meeting mine. "The doctors say you'll recover, but it was close. We thought you might not make it." Her words hung in the air, empty and emotionless. She didn't sound relieved. She sounded trapped, like she didn't know how to play the part of the concerned wife anymore. And Greg, why was he the one who found me? Why was he here at all? A gnawing unease settled in my stomach. It wasn't just the accident. Something was wrong. "Where's the driver?" I croaked, my throat dry and raw. "They fled the scene," Greg replied too quickly. "No one knows who it was. But don't worry. The police are investigating." My eyes moved between them, searching for something, anything, that made sense. But all I could see were their anxious glances toward each other. The awkward silence that filled the room after Greg's explanation. The kind of silence that hides secrets. The kind of silence that lies that as the days passed. The hospital room became a prison of its own. My body ached with every movement, but it was the mental fog that weighed me down more than anything. That gnawing feeling, the suspicion I couldn't shake, began to fester. Anna visited sporadically, always with the same expression, detached, cold, like she was fulfilling some unwanted obligation. She'd scroll through her phone, muttering something about work, offering brief updates on our child, Ethan. But there was no warmth, no comfort. Greg came by more often than I would have liked. At first, I thought he was just trying to play the concerned relative, but his visits always felt forced, as though he had a role to play. He'd bring flowers, offer to run errands for Anna, and make small talk about my recovery. But the look in his eyes was what unnerved me the most, a look that seemed more anxious than caring, as if he was afraid I might remember something. The problem was I did remember something, or at least I was starting to. It was hazy, fractured, but the image of Greg's car, speeding down the road, flashed through my mind. Had he been the one driving? Was he the one who hit me? But why would he lie about it? Why would he cover it up? The pieces didn't fit, and the more I thought about it, the more everything felt wrong. I started watching them more closely. Anna and Greg. Whenever they were in the room together, there was a tension that went beyond the usual family stress. Their interactions were clipped, guarded, like they were walking on eggshells. I saw the quick glances between them, the way Anna would glance at the door before she left, almost as if she were relieved to be leaving the room. One evening, after a particularly strained visit, I decided to test something. I pretended to fall asleep while Greg was sitting by the window, scrolling through his phone. I heard the soft rustle of fabric, the quiet footsteps approaching my bed. Through barely open eyes, I saw Greg leaning over me, his face inches from mine. For a moment, I thought he was going to say something, but he didn't. He just stared. And then, almost imperceptibly, he whispered, "I'm sorry." Sorry? For what? For the accident? For something worse? My mind raced as I lay there, motionless, my heart thudding in my chest. There was something between them, Greg and Anna. Something they weren't telling me. And I had a sickening feeling that it was much bigger than just an accident. The next day, I made a decision. I hired a private investigator. I couldn't confront Anna or Greg until I knew more. I needed proof, not just suspicion. I needed to know if my instincts were right, or if this paranoia was the result of too much time alone in this sterile room. A week later, the investigator called with the first piece of real information. My stomach dropped as he spoke. "You were right to be suspicious," he said. "Your wife and your uncle, they've been seeing each other for months." It felt like the ground had been ripped out from beneath me. The air in the room grew thick as rage, and betrayal coiled tightly around my chest. It was worse than I had imagined. Not only had Anna betrayed me, but Greg, someone I trusted, someone who had always been a constant in our lives, was complicit. The accident. Was it really an accident at all? Amidst the growing storm of betrayal and confusion, something unexpected happened. The woman from the accident, the one whose face I couldn't forget, reappeared in my life. Her name was Lena. It was the middle of the afternoon when she came into my hospital room, her presence soft but commanding. Dressed in a simple sweater and jeans, her dark hair was pulled back, revealing striking eyes that seemed to hold a mixture of concern and something else, something I couldn't quite place. It was strange, seeing her standing there after the chaos of that day. Yet, for some reason, it felt like she belonged. "I'm sorry to intrude," she began, her voice low and sincere. "I don't know if you remember me. I was the one who found you after the accident." Found me? My pulse quickened. Everything I thought I knew about that day had revolved around Greg claiming he found me. But now, standing before me, was this stranger saying otherwise. "I was driving by," she continued, stepping closer. "I saw you lying there, bleeding unconscious. I couldn't just leave you, so I called for help." I stared at her, trying to reconcile this new piece of information with what Greg had told me. Why would he lie about finding me? The question buzzed in my head, adding to the growing web of deceit I was untangling. "I wanted to check on you," she added, her eyes scanning my face as though looking for any sign that I remembered more than I had let on. "I've been thinking about that day a lot. It felt wrong to just disappear after what happened. Her presence was calming, a sharp contrast to the suffocating tension that hung over me whenever Anna or Greg were around. Lena wasn't offering rehearsed concern or half-hearted sympathy. She was genuine, and for the first time since the accident, I felt a flicker of relief. I found myself telling her more than I should have about my suspicions about Greg and Anna. Her face tightened with sympathy, but she didn't try to offer empty reassurances. She just listened. "It's strange," I admitted, my voice dropping. "Greg told me he was the one who found me. But you're saying it was you?" Lena frowned, confusion creasing her brow. "No one else was there when I found you." "I'm sure of it." Her words landed heavily, confirming what I had already suspected. Greg had lied. But why? What reason did he have to claim he found me, unless he had something to hide? As the silence stretched between us, Lena shifted slightly, her gaze steady on me. "I don't want to overstep, but if there's anything I can do to help, just let me know." I felt a strange pull toward her. Maybe it was the way she had entered my life at the exact moment everything else was crumbling. Or maybe it was just the fact that she was the only person who seemed to care without an agenda. We exchanged numbers before she left, and though it felt wrong, almost like a betrayal of the life I was still clinging to, I couldn't help but feel grateful. Lena was a lifeline, a small thread of hope in the middle of the mess I was sinking into. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, my thoughts spinning faster than I could manage. I couldn't stop thinking about Lena, about what she had told me. If Greg had lied about that, what else was he hiding? How far did this betrayal go? I knew I couldn't confront Anna or Greg yet. I needed more information, more proof. But what I had now was enough to light a fire inside me. And as I drifted into a restless sleep, one thing became clear. I wasn't going to let them get away with it. The days that followed felt like an agonizing limbo. I was trapped between the slow recovery of my physical wounds and the constant churning of my mind, now racing with suspicions and half-formed conclusions. Lena's visit had set something in motion. Her revelation had solidified my need for answers. And those answers were about to come sooner than I expected. It was late one evening, the hospital quiet except for the occasional beep of machines and the murmur of distant voices, when my phone buzzed. The private investigator I had hired, Dan Avery, was calling. My heart jumped as I answered, bracing myself for whatever he had found. "You were right to be worried," Dan began, his voice grim but steady. "There's a lot more going on than just the affair between your wife and your uncle." My grip tightened around the phone. I had expected the confirmation of the affair. It was the only explanation for Anna and Greg's strange behavior. But his tone suggested something worse. "Go on," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Your wife and your uncle have been involved for months," Dan continued. "But here's the kicker. They were together the day of the accident. Both of them were in your uncle's car." My chest tightened. I had suspected Greg might have been involved in the accident, but hearing it confirmed was like being punched in the gut. "They weren't just driving, though," Dan added, his voice dropping lower. "They were fighting. Witnesses said they saw the car swerving, heard shouting. Apparently, Greg lost control of the vehicle. That's when they hit you." I closed my eyes, feeling the bile rise in my throat. They had been fighting over what I didn't know, but the result was undeniable. They had hit me. My wife and my uncle had been in that car, and instead of helping me, they had fled. "They panicked," Dan said, as though reading my thoughts. "The moment they realized what had happened, they drove off. Didn't stop. Didn't call for help. They left you to die." The air left my lungs in a rush. I had imagined 100 scenarios, but this was unforgivable. Anna and Greg hadn't just betrayed me with their affair, they had almost killed me. And when given the chance to save me, they had run. "How do you know all this?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "I tracked down a few witnesses from that day," Dan explained. "A jogger saw the whole thing, but didn't get a good look at their faces. Then I pulled traffic camera footage from the area. The cameras didn't catch the accident itself, but I was able to identify Greg's car leaving the scene right after it happened. Silence hung between us as I processed the weight of what he was telling me. Greg's lies, Anna's indifference, the way they had hovered over me in the hospital as if nothing was wrong. It all made sense now. They had been hiding their guilt, covering up the accident they had caused. "You're sure?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Absolutely," Dan replied. "I've got the footage and the witness statements to back it up." I sat in stunned silence, my thoughts racing. There was no more room for doubt, no more room for the hope that maybe this was all just some horrible misunderstanding. The truth was laid bare in front of me, ugly, raw, and undeniable. Anna and Greg had been having an affair. They had been in the car that nearly killed me. And when they realized what they had done, they ran. If it hadn't been for Lena, I might have died on that road. My body found hours later, the truth buried with me. I wasn't just the victim of betrayal anymore. I had been the target of their cowardice, their selfishness. And now that I knew, I was going to make sure they paid for it. "Dan," I said, my voice cold, "I need every piece of evidence you have. I want them to pay for what they've done. Both of them. You'll have it all by tomorrow," Dan promised. "And if you want to take this to court, I know a lawyer who's ruthless. You're going to want someone like that on your side." I thanked him and hung up, my mind already racing ahead to what needed to be done. I couldn't confront them yet. Not until I had everything in place. But soon, they would know exactly what it felt like to lose everything. The next few days felt like a blur of quiet rage and icy resolve. My body might have been healing, but my mind was set on one thing: making sure Anna and Greg suffered for what they'd done. I knew I had to play my cards carefully, act as if nothing had changed. The last thing I needed was for them to suspect that I was onto them. Anna visited the hospital as usual, her cold mask of concern perfectly in place. She asked the same empty questions, gave the same shallow updates about our son, Ethan. I nodded, smiled in all the right places, and pretended that I didn't know about the affair, that I didn't know they had left me to die on the road. I had all the proof now. Dan had sent me everything. The traffic footage, witness statements, photos of Anna and Greg sneaking off to be together. I had enough to destroy both of them, and yet I waited. I wanted to see how far they would take their lies, how deeply they believed they could deceive me. But it was getting harder to hold back, especially as my connection with Lena deepened. She continued to visit me in the hospital, her presence a welcome escape from the storm brewing inside me. We talked about everything: her job, my recovery, the things I used to enjoy before my life unraveled. There was something so natural about the way we spoke, a calm in her that eased the sharp edges of my anger. With Lena, I could breathe again, if only for a few hours. Still, I kept her at arm's length. I wasn't ready for anything more, not while my world was falling apart. But the way she looked at me, the way her eyes softened when I talked about Ethan, the way she seemed to genuinely care about my well-being, it stirred something in me that I hadn't felt in years. Not since Anna had stopped looking at me that way. I wasn't sure what would happen with Lena, but I knew one thing for certain: she was the only person in my life who hadn't lied to me. She had saved me, in more ways than one. The day I left the hospital, I made sure to act as if nothing had changed. Greg was the one who picked me up, his usual too cheerful smile plastered on his face as he helped me into the car. "Glad to see you're finally out of there," he said, glancing at me sideways. "You'll be back to normal in no time." "Yeah," I replied, forcing a smile. "Thanks for everything, Greg." The lie tasted bitter on my tongue, but I swallowed it down. I needed him to believe I was still in the dark. When we arrived home, Anna was waiting. She greeted me with a quick hug, the kind you give an acquaintance rather than a spouse. She asked the usual questions, offered to help me get settled, but I waved her off. I didn't want her anywhere near me. Not yet. Over the next few days, I played my part, limping around the house, pretending to be the grateful husband, pretending I didn't notice how often Greg was over at our house. He would bring groceries or stop by to check on me, always finding excuses to hover. And Anna? She made sure her phone was glued to her hand, disappearing into other rooms for hushed conversations she thought I didn't notice. But I noticed everything. Then one night I decided it was time. I waited until Ethan was asleep, the house quiet, before calling Anna into the living room. She looked at me with that same distant expression, as if she were already bracing for the usual dull exchange we had become so accustomed to. "We need to talk," I said, my voice steady but cold. She nodded, sitting down across from me, her eyes flicking to her phone before she set it down on the table. I took a deep breath, the weight of everything about to come crashing down. "I know about you and Greg." The color drained from her face instantly. For the first time in months, I saw real emotion, shock, fear, guilt. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. I leaned forward, locking eyes with her. "I know about the affair. I know you've been seeing him for months. And I know that the two of you were in the car that hit me." Her eyes widened, panic flickering across her face. Don't bother lying." I cut her off, my voice low and dangerous. "I have everything. Traffic footage, witnesses, proof of the affair. You and Greg left me to die on that road. The only reason I'm sitting here right now is because someone else stopped and saved my life. You and him didn't even care." Tears welled up in her eyes, but I felt nothing. Whatever love or pity I might have once felt for her was gone, replaced by a cold, seething fury. I never wanted this to happen," she whispered, her voice shaking. "It was an accident. We didn't know what to do. We panicked." "Panicked?" I spat. "You left me there to die, Anna. Do you even understand what you've done? You've destroyed everything." She broke down, sobbing into her hands, but I wasn't moved. This wasn't remorse. This was guilt because she had been caught. "I'm filing for divorce," I said, standing up. "I'm taking full custody of Ethan, and I'll make sure Greg pays for what he did, too. You're both going to face the consequences." Anna looked up at me, her face pale, tears streaking her cheeks. "Please don't do this. I didn't mean for it to go this far. I just wanted—" "Save it," I said coldly, turning away from her. "You've already made your choices." And with that, I left her sitting there in her guilt and shame. I knew it wasn't over yet. There would be legal battles ahead, more lies and excuses from both her and Greg. But now I was in control. I had all the cards. And I wasn't going to let them get away with it. The days following my confrontation with Anna were a whirlwind of calculated moves. My emotions had become a distant hum, drowned out by the cold precision of my plans. The only way forward was to hit them where it hurt the most, legally, financially, and emotionally. I wasted no time filing for divorce. My lawyer, an old colleague of Dan's, was exactly what I needed: ruthless, strategic, and efficient. She took one look at the evidence Dan had collected and assured me that I had a strong case, not just for divorce, but for full custody of Ethan. The affair, the abandonment at the scene of the accident, and Anna's general neglect of our family were all points we could use against her. And then there was Greg. I wanted him to suffer just as much as Anna, if not more. It wasn't enough to expose the affair. He had to pay for what he did, both legally and financially. That's why I worked with my lawyer to press charges for reckless endangerment and fleeing the scene of an accident. Greg had broken the law, and he was going to face the consequences. The legal wheels turned quickly. Anna tried to fight, of course, but she was in no position to win. The traffic footage, the witness statements, and the affair left her with little defense. I sat through the divorce proceedings, calm and composed, watching her unravel piece by piece as every secret, every lie, was dragged into the light. But the real victory came during the custody battle. Anna's lawyer tried to paint her as a loving mother who had made mistakes. They used her tears, her regret, as their main defense. But my lawyer had no mercy. She presented the evidence: Anna's long absences, her constant focus on her affair, her decision to leave me on the side of the road. And then To seal the deal, we played the traffic footage. The courtroom fell silent as the grainy video showed Greg's car speeding away from the scene, leaving me for dead. I didn't look at Anna. I didn't need to. I already knew she was broken. The judge's decision came swiftly. I was granted full custody of Ethan. Anna was allowed supervised visitation, but that was all. She wouldn't be raising our son. Not anymore. I watched as the verdict was delivered, a wave of finality washing over me. This was what I had fought for, not just to sever the ties between us, but to protect Ethan from the chaos that Anna had brought into our lives. She was still sobbing, her head in her hands, as the courtroom emptied out. But her tears meant nothing to me now. Greg's downfall was just as brutal. The charges of reckless endangerment and fleeing the scene were enough to ensure a trial. His lawyer tried to negotiate a deal, but I refused. I wanted him to face the full force of the law. During the trial, the same traffic footage was played, the same witness testimonies recounted. It was undeniable. Greg had been reckless, and his decision to leave me there, bleeding and unconscious, had sealed his fate. The courtroom was tense as the verdict was read. Greg was sentenced to prison. It wasn't a long sentence, but it was enough to ruin him. He'd never recover his reputation, his career, or his finances. The settlement I was awarded would ensure that. I stood outside the courthouse after the trial, the weight of everything finally beginning to lift. Greg's life was in shambles. Anna's too. The lies they had built their lives on had crumbled, and they had no one to blame but themselves. The autumn air was crisp as I stood outside the courthouse, my hands in my pockets, watching as people passed by. It was over. The months of deception, the lies, the betrayal, they were all behind me now. I had won, but it didn't feel like the victory I had imagined. Lena was waiting for me, standing by her car a few steps away. When she saw me, she smiled softly, that warm, genuine smile that had become my anchor through all of this. She had been by my side during the trial, offering quiet support, never pushing, just there. I walked over to her, the weight of everything beginning to loosen its grip on my chest. "How are you feeling?" she asked, her voice gentle. "Lighter," I admitted, leaning against the car next to her. "It's strange. I thought I'd feel more. Angry. Vindicated. But all I feel is relief." She nodded, understanding in her eyes. "Sometimes that's enough." We stood there for a while, the silence between us comfortable. For the first time in what felt like years, I didn't have to pretend. I didn't have to fight. I could just be. Lena glanced at me, her gaze lingering for a moment before she spoke again. "So, what's next for you?" I smiled, looking up at the clear sky. "I don't know, but I think it's time to figure that out. Maybe spend more time with Ethan, rebuild what I lost. I don't want him growing up with the shadow of all this hanging over him." She smiled, and I could see the unspoken question in her eyes. The question of whether there might be something more between us, something that had been simmering just beneath the surface for weeks. I wasn't ready to answer that question yet, but I knew I wasn't shutting the door on it either. For now, I was content with the quiet, with the calm after the storm. I had taken back control of my life, and for the first time in years, I was free. Thanks for watching. Thumbs up, subscribe, and comment below.